This is Talk is Sheep, the official podcast of the Wild Sheep Society of BC, brought to you by Sitka Gear. Come along as we bring conversations that matter to you into the high alpine. This episode is sponsored by our conservation partner, Yeti. Thank you, Sitka Gear and Yeti, for investing in healthy wildlife and sustainable ecosystems. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are on Talk is Sheep, and I have to say that this is a real exciting podcast for us. We're joined by Corey Mason, who is the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the Wild Sheep Foundation. Wild Sheep Foundation being, of course, our biggest partner here in British Columbia, and our godfather that looks after all things wild sheep in the world. So, Corey, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be with you, Kyle. I appreciate it. Thanks much, sir.
Yeah, well, it's awesome to have you on, and really exciting to have you here. You've been doing such great work in the world of conservation. I know that you joined the Wild Sheep Foundation just is it a year ago now? What's the timelines on that?
We're close to that. So August will be the 1 year mark.
Awesome. So obviously your name is synonymous with conservation. So when we talk about conservation and some of the leaders out there, your name will definitely come up in that list. And of course, you were previously working over at the Dallas Safari Club and doing great work there. And then, we had the privilege of you joining the Wild Sheep Foundation. So real exciting to have you here, Corey. And we haven't been able to chat since you've joined the foundation. I'm really, really excited to catch up with you today.
I appreciate that. Yeah, looking forward to our conversation here and many productive ones down the line.
Excellent. So I guess, Corey, maybe for our listeners, I know, again, the name is very familiar and a lot of people know you really well, but for those that don't, maybe just give us a little bit of your background and back to the early days and sort of how you got into the conservation world.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Again, thanks for the opportunity to be here with you, Kyle. My whole from childhood through high school and into college was really around the outdoors. Grandfather that farmed and ranched, and my dad sacrificially took me every chance he could at the risk of his own not having opportunities, but really grateful for that. So enjoyed the outdoors, hunting, fishing, anything we could do my whole life. And so that was obviously very formative for me wanting to pursue a career in conservation. And upon graduating high school, I got a bachelor's degree in wildlife conservation and in management specifically, and then actually left for a couple of years after graduating with my undergraduate. Worked for a private landowner out in West Texas that owned a lot of country out there, managed a lot of country, I should say. So worked on ranches, guiding, outfitting, all that kind of good stuff. Then went back to graduate school to continue my conservation and management degree, got a master's degree, and that directly led into me a career with Texas Parks and Wildlife. So worked as a state agency biologist for a little over 16 years. Began as an on-the-ground management area biologist, so direct habitat management from prescribed fire to grazing management to research to a lot of educational programs with academia, kids on the ground, landscape, landowner education. And then through my time with Parks and Wildlife, kind of transitioned into a few different duties. And when I left Parks and Wildlife, I was a regional director. Fantastic time there at state agency, and still keep in touch with my colleagues. And in fact, we'll see many of them later this week at a sheep symposium, in fact. But after 16 years with Texas Parks and Wildlife, I transitioned to Dallas Safari Club, where I was CEO over DSC and the foundation for 7 years there. And then made to move to, really quickly at DSC, really focused on international conservation programs. So worked globally, obviously worked extensively with the Fish and Wildlife Service here in the States, but worked with management authorities all over the world, and then made the move here to Wild Sheep Foundation in August, and so grateful for the opportunity.
So, you think back to those formative years and you getting interested in the outdoors, and you worked so hard as a biologist and on the ground and really involved in direct projects. And then to go into like a senior management role, both with Dallas Safari Club and now Wild Sheep Foundation. I don't imagine, were you thinking do you think, one day I'm going to run one of these organizations and be at that sort of higher level, and really high level management. So do you ever envision something like that? And how does that change the way you do business, and have you enjoyed it?
It does. That's a really insightful question, Kyle. So, I think about some of the fond memories of times on the ground. I was between undergrad and graduate school, of course, working on the ground, and in graduate school, I worked on a lot of projects. And one of those, I spent a summer catching alligators. We were doing a maternity and paternity test on to determine if it was an open or closed population of inland alligators to see if it would sustain a hunting program, regulated hunting program. And so for an entire summer, I ran around day and night catching alligators. And as a young man, how cool a job is that? So that was really fun. I had a partner with me that he and I were just out on the ground, just working together. Obviously, extremely remote, pretty dangerous work, but we had a great time. So I think of those days to now, with having the opportunity to help lead and influence conservation policy at various scales, and I think honestly, sort of introspectively, that being able to have the time and experience of doing that also leads to some credibility of understanding what does it take to deliver conservation practically and yet also at a meaningful scale. I know when I was a regional director, when we would hire new biologists, many didn't have a background on the ground, so they didn't know what it was like to, for example, run a boat, maybe start a tractor and put in a fire line, or they just didn't understand those things, and it was important for me for them to understand that. So when they made a habitat prescription to a landowner, they understood that this action is very costly, both in time and resources and financially. So sort of trying to weave all those things together, and then now help guide and shape that at the policy level. It is very impactful. And back when I was, on the ground working with hunting programs and research, no, answer your question, I never thought I would have the opportunity to be in this kind of a position.
Well, you've sure done a great job in both organizations and garnered so much respect within the industry for the work that you're doing, Corey. Now, you've with the transition over to the foundation. The foundation tends to, a lot of the projects are, well, obviously they're sheep centric and most of them are North American centric, although, there is the international programs. Have you found, is there much difference? Are you working on the international side of things? And obviously with Dallas Safari Club, you guys had a very, very long and very impactful global reach. And I feel maybe with the foundation, the focus is more a little bit back here in North America.
Yeah, I'm enjoying it tremendously. Like you say, the focus, of course, Wild Sheep Foundation is largely North America, Canada, Mexico within North America. But, there obviously is some international work. But the good thing is from 25 plus years in the conservation space that not all, but many or most of the state agency contacts and certainly, federal level contacts, I have relationships with many of those. And so, it's just sort of resuming conversations. Maybe the focus changes a little bit, but scale of opportunity for impact remains the same. And so just for example, we were in Washington, D.C. last week. Gray and I were on the Hill and spending a lot of time there focusing on Forest Service BLM policy and opportunities for conservation impact, and a lot of those are people that I've worked with for decades plus. And so we just sort of resuming those conversations and kind of refocusing on them. And so, yeah, the work is extremely rewarding at Wild Sheep Foundation because it's so focused on the ground habitat work. And it's really rewarding.
So on that note, Corey, like we look at the foundation and I when I look at the foundation, for me, I tend to think first of on the ground work, but there's the advocacy side as well. As you mentioned, Greg Schildwalker's in Washington day in and day out advocating for the foundation there. I feel like, that's one of the things that you've really brought to the foundation is those connections back in Washington. How important is that? Is it more important than ever? Or is it more important than ever that our money's going on the ground? Sort of, how do you see it from a sort of a high level perspective within the foundation on, focusing priorities? Do we have to be as active in Washington as we do on the ground? Where's that split and how important is it? More important than ever today than it's ever been, or is it less important?
Yeah, great question. So I think we can never take our eye and focus off on the ground projects. That is where conservation delivery happens. Literally the turning the shovel, the running of the water, wherever we may be working on the landscape. But that can never be a second tier priority. I think the good thing is with our team in place, we have the opportunity to be effective in both spaces. Greg and Charlie are super effective in where they work. And yet we also have, through those relationships, the opportunity to be mindful of what's going on and we're not an organization that's going to be a saber rattler over every issue that's out there because frankly, that's very ineffective. If you're against everything, people become tone deaf to you really fast. But when you have the voice to number one, support projects or policy, I should say, in this case, policy that's meaningful and impactful, you get credibility in the space. We don't lend our name to everything because some things are just out of our lane. We don't need to be touching those things. And we don't put out a press release just to put out a press release. We don't support letters, put our name on letters that are not meaningful. But yet when we lean into those spaces and we engage in a policy matter, such as these public lands issues that are coming up, emerging right now, that when we do so, it's from a very thoughtful way. It's not to get out there and honestly, unfortunately, like many organizations do, that use it as an opportunity for fundraising. Rather, we engage in a thoughtful way to honestly, many times, slow the conversation down and say, hey, let's have some cool heads here and let's prevail with some meaningful dialogue.
So, in this modern era, lots of people are advocating for on the ground work. Talk a little bit about the importance of these conversations with relations to public lands. And you mentioned the public lands issue. So maybe let's dive into that a little bit more. I'm seeing a bit more on that issue as of late from the foundation. A couple of years back, we weren't seeing a whole lot on it. Is that because there's a bigger threat now than there ever has been? Or is it just sort of an awareness now that, oh no, we have to be in that arena as well? Obviously it's important to our membership. That's very clear, but maybe touch a bit on that for us, Corey.
Yeah, recognizing that, certainly within the U.S., that by far the majority of wild sheep populations occur on public land and under some banner, that's BLM or Forest Service or whatever it might be. So we certainly have to have an active presence there in supporting on the ground projects, conservation proper, habitat work, guzzler bill, whatever it might be, depends on, again, where we are in the landscape. But we also have to understand how policy impacts the ability to do that work and conservation funding associated with that. The last, I'll just say couple of months for a round number there's been some conversations, bits and pieces, which is always dangerous, of conversation around some public land transfers, maybe sales. And there's been enough vagueness around it that it created uncertainty, which then created uncomfortableness. People were concerned, and maybe rightfully so. And so, it was a conversation that we plugged in. We've had a lot of conversation. Greg's had a lot of conversations in DC. It was the focus of our time in DC recently, when we were on the Hill. And it is meaningful because how public lands are managed determines, of course, the ability, number one, of the American public to be able to gain access to those lands and use them for hiking, recreating, fishing, shooting, and certainly hunting. But then the ability to access and manage populations and habitat in a quality manner, very important. And so recently there were discussions when it came from a budget reconciliation standpoint. And so I'll try not to get too weedy here, but from a policy standpoint, but there are some general processes that are outlined for the ability for BLM and Forest Service to transfer lands. It may not be useful. They may be landlocked or no access or adjacent to a city, bits and pieces, things like that maybe really aren't useful to the greater public interest, if you will. So that's one conversation. But the other conversation that was happening parallel to that was this unknown, just general disposal or exchange of public lands, with a large acreage and dollar figure associated with them. And then very recently in the last few days, it kind of came to light, and there was a proposal that came about in budget reconciliation. And so the most concerning thing about that, because it's not the typical process, is that if lands were exchanged or sold, then those dollars would go to the general treasury, not be maintained within the budget of like the U.S. Forest Service or BLM. So if the dollars went to the treasury, there would be no certainty and practically probably no likely of them ever going back to public lands. And so that's been our focus of engagement.
Yeah, so that's a little unnerving, considering. So I guess in this, budgets that are currently going to conservation-centric or kind of conservation-minded issues could easily go to roads or go to whatever, social programs, that sort of thing. So you talked a little bit about the transfer of funds, like the money going to central treasury as opposed to BLM or other resources. What about the like public access itself? So I think you mentioned like there's some areas that aren't that are maybe landlocked or they're maybe not, so they're not being used by the general public. Is that what you're sharing? So the issue was around it wasn't so much about public access; it was more so about loss of maybe habitat and loss of dollars to support habitat that maybe wasn't really a general. There wasn't heavy public access on that area anyway. Am I correct understanding that correctly, Corey?
Yeah, so kind of two things. The initial concern, if you will, was which lands would be considered for disposal. And again, understanding there are some that are, I mean, almost within city limits that really aren't overly useful to the general public. And maybe the best use of those lands would be for a swap or trade or something like that, or the ability to put dollars back into, adjacent lands. And that's just sort of a meaningful, understandable, reasonable way, if you will, to manage those lands. Clearly, we're not in support of general disposition of public lands in any way, but those that make sense, that's understandable. So that was the initial sort of tip of the spear conversation. It wasn't until this last budget discussion, just in the last few days, that this new means of trying to move the state, or excuse me, of public lands came about now, that resulted in the secondary concern of, hey, now we would additionally lose the ability for these dollars to be reinvested into public land. So that's kind of the emerging part of it.
Okay. So quite often I know that speaking to Greg in the past, that a lot of the work that he does is alongside coalitions. That there's obviously when you show up with 10 well-respected organizations with thousands of members, you get much more traction than, going solo. How much of this is a collaborative effort, or is it sort of something that we're having to sort of fight on our own? I'm sure there's lots of interest in this issue with other organizations as well.
Yeah, a good question. So there are a number of organizations that, some that are out there that I don't think are providing clarity to the conversation. Rather, they're providing, panic, and maybe they're doing so for selfish reasons, to be overly candid. And others that are, a few others that we're having conversations with. But a lot of this, we're working with some really close partners on to provide substantive comments, not just fear tactics that your public lands are being stolen from you. That doesn't do any good. But rather it's like, okay, well, let's provide or present this in a responsible, meaningful way. And secondarily, and importantly, let's provide proposed solutions.
And how are those conversations going? Like, can you touch on that? It's always, lobbying and advocacy work is always really challenging, right? You never really know until all of a sudden there's a decision made, and you're like, oh, darn, we didn't get what we wanted there, or we, hey, we did better than we thought, or this is awesome, either one. So how's that going so far?
Yeah, that is the nature of the beast. You don't know where it lands until it's actually landed, right? But so far conversations have been really constructive. And again, with good relationships that we have the ability to have those conversations in a respectful way. And even with some members of Congress, that it's like, let me tell you where we are position wise. And it may be a little different alignment than you are, but let me tell you why. And we talk through those things in a very, again, reasonable manner. And maybe we agree to disagree sometimes, and that's okay, but our voice is heard,
Yeah, right on. Okay, so we touched a little bit on the public access and some of the concerns there. From a policy or legislative perspective and Washington concerned, what are some of the issues? And was there some stuff going on in the state of Montana as well that was on the radar that we're really concerned about? So maybe just touch of some of the big issues in Washington, and then maybe some of the regional stuff, if you don't mind.
Yeah, you bet. So back to kind of the federal level real quick. Really management and the ability to manage public lands, and specifically from a Wild Sheep Foundation perspective, what does that grazing allotment look like? And specifically that speaks into that risk of contact associated with grazing allotments allocated to sheep or transferred from cattle to sheep. Just trying to ensure that we don't have contact between domestic sheep and wild sheep to reduce that chance for, disease occurrence. And then secondarily, and always an impact on our public lands, particularly the arid western landscapes, is horse and burro management. We have tens of thousands of those horses on the landscape, and a budget of $100+ million just to feed those horses right now in captivity, basically. And so it's not responsible management either for the resource, and certainly not for the landscape. So that was some of the issues that we spoke to last week while in DC. And many people don't really quite understand all the challenges around that, horses and burros, but it certainly affects a lot of sheep country. And then the impact to, just ecosystem health as a whole, ground compaction, soil water recharge, all of those things, just responsible management. And to the Montana. So there was a House Bill 283 that was introduced that would add some language to the existing conservation permits that would move those from an auction and give the ability to add or raffle. Well, the challenges with that, as you know, is that raffles typically, now I'm using a bit of a broad brush, but typically raise around half the amount of money as the conservation permits do when they're auctioned. And so what that directly means is just less dollars to manage sheep well and effectively. And so, we support our state conservation agencies and tribal partners, et cetera, and support them with how they're moving forward to manage their conservation programs. But the problem is this did not come from them. This came from outside influence, and it wasn't something that others were asking for. And so it doesn't add equity, rather because those raffles already exist. And it would have just simply reduced the dollars available to manage sheep well.
So what was the outcome of House Bill 283? Was it defeated or?
It was defeated as of about a week ago. So it was vetoed specifically by the governor.
Okay. So we're seeing a little bit more, and there's a few things I want to dive into, and I want to touch base on the stuff you talked about earlier, but this one's topical now that it's come up. But so with regards to auction versus raffle, and we've seen that now in Arizona. So Arizona has, I think we auctioned their last sheep permit off at Sheep Show this past January, and they've transitioned now to this raffle model. Is that an emerging threat to sort of the fundraising side of things as far as the Foundation of Wild Sheep are concerned? And do we see this sort of a perpetual issue, or is this just sort of a flash in the pan? And we've seen 2 states now that are pretty serious on it. Is this coming to a state near us, or what are your thoughts on that, Corey?
Yeah, I think to the Arizona specifically, that came from the commission level, so it wasn't a legislatively directed thing, which is good because it gives them the ability annually to evaluate, what is the fiscal impact to this? What is the impact to the resources? And in fact, like I mentioned a while ago, Wild Sheep Foundation is here to support the resources and the state management authorities in this case. And so Wild Sheep Foundation was really the only one to step forward and said, hey, we will help you promote and sell this, raffle this permit specifically, I should say. And that's actually ongoing basically right now through the end of June. And so be anxious to see, what dollars it raises for sheep conservation programs, for surveys and on the ground work and all the necessary programmatic fiscal needs. And so, but what does it look like more broadly? There are a few states that are looking at that right now. And I think they're not looking at it because it's best for the sheep resource. They're looking at it from a human dimension standpoint. And we'll kind of wait and see. We're clearly communicating. Wild Sheep Foundation provides back to all the states in which we manage their conservation permits and sell them specifically and provide that revenue share back to them, or those revenues back to them specifically annually. Here's where these dollars went, or here they are to you. And so we're continuing to encourage the states to be very specific then outwardly as to how they use those dollars for their conservation programs, for wild sheep. And this well, Kyle, that we can show where every dollar is spent from a conservation impact standpoint. And we're encouraging the states to do so the same through these conservation permits. But I do expect there's other states that are probably watching, states like Arizona, to see how does this go for a couple of years. But many others are very, very, very specific in which, no, this is the way that we can maximize the return of the dollar. And we're not even interested in that at all.
Mm-hmm. So House Bill 283 in Montana, was that brought forward by who brought that bill forward? I think, it has to be a legislature that introduced it, but it's been driven by somebody. Is that well known? And we don't have to give specific names. Was it a conservation organization that brought that forward?
It was brought indirectly, my understanding, through a specific organization, through, of course, a House member, like you say. And it went through committees and it went through the process. And there were others that understood within that, hey, understand the fiscal impact this makes on your state conservation agency's ability to effectively manage sheep. And ultimately, the resource was kept in mind, and the bill is not moving forward. It's done now. It's been vetoed, thankfully, which was the right approach for the best for sheep management and other species as well that work through this same model. So thankfully that was done, but there is no naiveness that it forever will not be resurrected or brought back up in a different manner. So that's always something that we'll be keeping our eye on and trying to work forward through.
Yeah. So, on this subject, when we talk about that, that's the one thing I'll always give kudos to the foundation. Why I love the organization, Wild Sheep Foundation, is that, sheep are first, right? Like, and, people will argue what they'll argue, but at the end of the day, here we have the Wild Sheep Foundation supporting Arizona. So, that's the model that we're not, really, we're concerned about the loss of these tags because that's the big revenue generator. That's the best bang for your buck when it comes to wild sheep conservation. So the foundation could have easily sat on the sidelines and said, yeah, no, and let the raffle do its thing. It's probably not going to perform that well because for a variety of reasons, as we know that we just discussed. But no, what's the foundation doing? There was kind of, I guess, an RFP, somebody that could take up the mantle to do the raffle, and the foundation put their name forward, and they've got the permit there, and they're marketing it. And I know the foundation's putting a lot of time, money, and resources into this. I think you're leading that program, aren't you, Corey?
Yeah, there's several of us that are working on it, and it's a significant commitment of both staff resources, and 100% of the return is going back to Arizona. So Wild Sheep Foundation burdens all the costs for marketing as well. So it's a very significant investment on our part.
Yeah, so tens of thousands of dollars going to an outside organization, and you guys are driving that. And you could have very well sat on the sidelines and said, "Okay, let them fail," But no, we're applying all this money into this raffle to see it to be successful, because at the end of the day, that's the best we can do under the given circumstances for wild sheep conservation. And again, we're putting wild sheep first, and other organizations they're putting whatever other issues first. It's certainly not what's best for wild sheep.
It is. And, we have deployed full resources from this. We've called in partners to market and send out e-blast and from a marketing standpoint, from a print ad material and videos. And so, we are hoping that this is wildly successful. But we know at the end of the day that we've put everything we can into this, and we'll see where it lands. But again, we're trying to raise every dollar we can for resource management.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, inspirational. It's great, and love to see it. Okay, let's pivot. Corey, what else is going on in the wild sheep world? Maybe you got the GIA grant and aid process. They've got that opening up, I think July 1st. So a lot of good stuff there. A lot of great projects being doing. Do you want to talk about maybe some of the flagship projects that the foundation's been able to execute on in the last year here? I know the Franklin Mountains and back in your home state's a big one there. So maybe touch on some of those projects for us.
Yeah, you bet. So the Grant and Aid program, which is a fantastic sort of hallmark for Wild Sheep Foundation, this year, 22 projects were funded at about 2.9 million grant and aid total, and about 3.7, mission program funding total. But those 22 projects really span the earth, or globe, if you will, from, like you say, Franklin Mountains project in Texas, where 77 desert bighorn sheep were captured on Elephant Mountain Wildlife Management Area, one of the really last safe holds of MOV-free sheep herds in Texas, in which aoudad are not really occurring on Elephant Mountain. They're right knocking on the door, right on the fringe. And so 77 sheep were captured. Of course, health status check performed so that only healthy sheep were moved just north of El Paso to the Franklin Mountains. And those sheep have done fantastically well. I think there have only been 2, maybe 3 sheep that have been lost from mortality, which is an amazing number. And on Valentine's Day, the first lambs were born. So pretty fantastic opportunity there. And then the hope is, of course, that now serves as a meta population for future translocations back. And so lots of work taking place there. Of course, lots of health work done all across the West, from the IAM projects and many others, all the way up into great projects happening in BC, right in your backyard there, Kyle. So some great projects, working on collaboration, of course, with our chapter and affiliate partners, state agencies, tribes in some cases as well, the First Nations as well. So Yeah, it's a really rewarding program, and like you say, applications will open soon in the next couple of months for that. And then, sort of internally, we've been working over the last several months to stand up a new grant management software. May kind of sound like a nuance, but when an external applicant has the ability to more effectively engage that program and work throughout the year on submissions and status and all of that, and then we have the ability to manage it internally as well. It's just really an important technology advancement for us. And so kind of an unseen thing, but will really move the ball as well in that capacity.
That's that's outstanding. So I think you said there was 22 projects at $2.9 million. Do I have my numbers correct on that?
Yes, sir.
So, and that is Wild Sheep Foundation dollars. That's not any of the tag money, any of the auction money. That's exclusively money that's raised by the foundation, redirected back to projects across, globally, but mostly North America.
That's correct.
Wow,
Yep.
that's pretty phenomenal. It's interesting. Some of the narrative out there I've heard over the years. Well, Wild Sheep Foundation, they take credit for all this money, but really it's just the auction money going to the state and tribal agencies through these auction tags. And that stat is pretty staggering when you look at $2.9 million. That's a significant amount of investment, and that's over and above the tag money. So the auction money, which is pretty phenomenal. Do you happen to have the stat on the money that was redirected to state and tribal agencies, in addition to that 2.9 million?
I don't have that. I want to say around 6 million, something like that off the cuff. But to come back just super quick, those grant and aid programs, those projects that are done within the U.S., many of those dollars can be matched 3 to 1 as well through Pittman Robertson Fund. So, for example, a $50,000 or $100,000 project quickly becomes a $300,000-$400,000 project if matched by the state with Pittman Robertson Fund. So the multiplication to the value of those dollars being a non-federal dollar, the impact far transcends even those numbers.
Absolutely. And I just look at the investment that the Wild Sheep Foundation has made here in British Columbia. So there's the state, tribal, and provincial money, the auction money that comes back for the BC Special Sheep Permit that's spent here in the province. But that's often matched or tripled or quadrupled by partner funding, whether it be through the Wild Sheep Society BC or other partners as well. So there's that money. And then through the grant and aid money that you guys direct here in the province, again, it's always in collaboration with somebody somewhere. There's always additional funding there. So, but you guys are the main source of money that comes into this province, and it's phenomenal, the amount of money in BC specifically that's spent. So, pretty exciting. Now, you've been involved in all these projects. It's kind of been your first year. You're getting your feet wet on the ground. What's your passion project? Which ones kind of stand out for you? Obviously, there's the great work that's been done in Texas, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. But is there anything that stands out as sort of a real exciting project for yourself?
There's some fantastic ones. I really love the projects that are sort of conservation scale, landscape scale programs. Like I look at the Thin Horn programs there in BC. Those projects are so impactful. And so they have such the ability to inform and then ultimately engage forward how we manage the species and specifically the species habitat as well, so that we can understand that ecology, the relationship of the animal to the environment and landscape relationship. So, those are really important projects as well. And then, you sort of flip to the other side and some of them are on the ground putting water in arid landscapes like in Mexico, so I don't know that one could necessarily be more measurable than the other, but they're all meeting unique needs within those landscapes. And just if you could allow me just a second of sort of freewheeling here, I think one of the things that's really important to me that I was really impressed with. So I joined the foundation in August, right at the tail end of the Grant and Aid program. But what was really impactful to me, because I've been involved with grant programs my entire career and either applied for grants and had the ability to serve on national committees with Fish and Wildlife Service grant programs. And then, of course, at the DSC Foundation as well. But the vetting process at the foundation is absolutely fantastic, meaning that the Wild Sheep Foundation conservation staff specifically go through and rank and rate the grant submissions. It's the greatest conservation need, value for dollar as well. And then again, the Professional Resource Advisory Board, which represent decades and decades of institutional knowledge, firsthand knowledge, experience. And the board as well vets and reviews and prioritizes. And so, and then this thing coalesces into a list, and ultimate approval by the board, of course, from both a project standpoint and then, of course, the associated dollars. And so the vetting process is really important for people to understand, because at the end of the day, it's not someone's pet project. Rather, it's a well vetted based on conservation need and value of the dollars. And so when that list of 22 rolls out, every one of those projects and programs are really meaningful.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And I guess maybe for our listeners, Corey, if you could maybe just touch a little bit on PRAB and sort of, not the individual members per se, but the interesting thing that I find with our Professional Resource Advisory Board is that it's very targeted. It's very region centric. It's species specific. There's habitat experts. There's disease experts. So maybe just talk about that board and how important it is to selecting these GIA projects.
Yeah, from year-round needs and opportunities and sort of prioritization to grant aid specifically. So to your point, I just sort of think a little bit vaguely offhand. I mean, like you say, you have veterinarians that are wildlife disease veterinarians that are on the Professional Resource Advisory Board. You have people that worked full careers, 30, 40 plus years for the Forest Service and BLM and academics and state agencies. And so the resource expertise there is second to none. And so they have the geographic representation north to south, globally as well. They understand the issues. They've lived the issues. They have contacts. They can quickly make calls to get feedback and help prioritize. And so, these are the people that are resource experts, and they give their time and talents freely because they care about the resource. They care about resource stewardship and landscape stewardship. And so they work hand in hand with both the conservation staff as well as the board at Wild Sheep. And so, we're really lucky to have that group of folks that really give of their time to do that.
Well, and I look like you guys have such deep benches. So we've got the 9 volunteers on PRAB, and then additionally there's yourself, Kevin Hurley, Kurt Alt. So between the three of you, how many years of experience do you guys have in the sort of fish, wildlife, and habitat realm? It's literally hundreds of years between the three of you. You guys are pretty young, but still, there's so much experience between the three of you guys, right?
You bet. It would be certainly between us three over 100 years, probably more like close to 100 and a half for sure. But and then you add PRAB in there, and that's several hundred as well. So there's a lot of good expertise and a lot of lessons learned there of things that not to replicate, right? Things that were tried and they weren't effective, and so which is equally important. A lot of expertise.
Yeah, I think having that sort of wisdom and that gray hair on PRAB or in your staff, it's good to have new ideas and fresh ideas and do new things, but it's also good to have, I listened to Kevin Hurley, and Kevin's like, you know what, we tried that 20 years ago. It didn't work. Why would it work now type thing, So, it's great to have those new ideas, those emerging thoughts, and being, taking risks, but also not at the expense of having made that mistake 20 years ago. It didn't work then. It's not going to work now type thing, right?
Absolutely. And I'll say too that having the opportunity now to work for say 7-8 months, whatever the number specifically is, with the board on a number of occasions, and specifically starting back to the allocation of which of these projects are going to be funded, to hear the commitment and the loyalty to Wild Sheep, and hey, which of these is the most impactful, and asking questions, seeking answers, and again, a board that is comprised of people that give of time and talents and treasures, and do so very selflessly. Yeah, it's really encouraging. It is a very fine foundation.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, let's talk a little bit some of the issues that are front and center, and I guess maybe for you, Corey, one thing that comes up over and over and over again is the disease issue, and you touched a little bit on the aoudad issue in Texas. And I don't know if we want to talk more holistically on a large scale on disease in general, or this aoudad issue. And I think the foundation's taken a look at that. There's some issues around there. This has been raised several times by TBS is obviously front and center. Sam's been very vocal on the aoudad issue and the challenges, and we know this transplant is in basically in response to the emerging disease issue with aoudad, and continues to grow and grow and grow. Maybe let's maybe peel back the aoudad issue a little bit, if you don't mind, for us. And of course, you're intimately involved with that, having been with Texas Park and Wildlife for so many years, and then your work through DSC and now the foundation.
Yeah. So specifically from a desert bighorn management, you can look pretty quickly at the factors affecting that species. Just to use Texas as an example, and we don't even really have to step into New Mexico or some of the other states to get a sort of good case study, is, you look not too far in the past, and the population in Texas was over 2,000 desert bighorn sheep, and now it's between 400 and 500. And in a pretty short period of time, with an ever increasing population of aoudad, which are an incredibly resilient species. And in fact, I was actually reading a comparison, a competition study this morning that was showing 94% survival year to year of aoudad. So an incredibly hardy species, that doesn't have a lot of annual, transgression out of the species or out of on an annual basis. And so what does that look like for desert bighorn sheep? So you have the obvious, there's this disease thing, but I think what's often overlooked is an arid landscape. You have resource allocation competition, meaning where aoudad are, desert bighorn sheep probably aren't going to allocate, but either way, if aoudad have been there or are coming, you have forage competition, you have water competition, you have all of those things that are direct threats. And so they are a direct threat with desert bighorn sheep. They have reduced the population significantly. So what are we going to do? So actually, in a couple of days, I'll be headed out to Sul Ross State University for the Desert Bighorn Sheep Symposium, and it's largely focused on a lot of that. With some of the experts you mentioned from PRAB will be there, and other resource state agency experts will be there for this conversation with landowners. So again, a little bit different challenge here is it's largely a private land state in which where these bighorns occur, and so it's not more difficult or less difficult. It's just difficult to manage, right? So these landowners are receiving compensation largely from the hunting of these aoudad. Many of them rely heavily on that. So it's a complex conversation, but aoudad certainly have a very negative impact on desert bighorn sheep.
So, in the perfect world, what's the path forward? What are some of the solutions that the wild sheep world's trying to offer, especially where there's a lot of competition, where it's become a huge revenue source for these outfitters that have these concessions now?
Yeah, it's a good question. So a number of landowners are also starting to express concern with aoudad because they're seeing declining populations of mule deer, obviously a native species. They've seen now and experienced in a significant hardship declines in desert bighorn sheep as well. So there are landowners that are raising their hands, some quietly and some a little bit more visibly, saying, what's the problem here with these aoudad and how do we deal with them? And so, I think if there is a continuum of landowners or a co-op large enough that would have the ability to start managing these aoudad, meaning very specifically culling aoudad, there would be the ability to start sort of rebuilding that habitat landscape back out. But the thought of having thriving desert bighorn sheep populations in contact with aoudad, it's simply not a reality. So the path forward, it won't be everywhere, again, because some landowners rely heavily on the income, and understandably so. No disregard meant. That's just the financial path forward for them, and it's understandable. But those that want to manage for desert bighorn sheep and maybe mule deer as well, they're understanding that we have to do something with these aoudad.
Do you envision extirpation of desert bighorn sheep in Texas if the current path continues?
I think there's a couple of populations now that are safeguarded to some extent. Again, not naive in any way, but I think if pretty drastic measures are not ensured to both safeguard those populations and then build back out the opportunity to now take those nursery herds to start repatriating, the future's pretty bleak, that's for sure. But there's opportunities there. There's opportunities there to restore these species back to this particular species back to native range and do so. It's going to be a lot of hard work and honestly very expensive, but it can be done.
Yeah, awesome. The Franklin Mountain transplant was very successful, and I guess that's so. But one of the challenges I understand is there's just not a lot of areas that are protected or safe. Are there other areas that they can use to transplant these sheep native range, or not necessarily?
At the time, not really. Most of that
Yeah.
native range has aoudad to some extent in it. Some of it's absolutely chock full of aoudad, and others not as much, but aoudad control would have to take place before sheep could be really moved back.
Hmm. Yeah. So what does that look moving forward? Is it a collaboration or cooperation with landowners and outfitters, or is this something that can be done at the state level from a policy perspective or legislation? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a state agency-led initiative working really cooperatively with the landowners and with organizations like Texas Bighorn Society. Obviously, is a great partner, as it has been with Texas Parks and Wildlife for many, many years. And clearly, Wild Sheep Foundation there is part of that as well to help fund that, research that, and develop that out. But there is a good path forward. But again, it's just costly, and it will really result in people kind of having an awakening if they want to sort of change the paradigm.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay, let's talk a little bit on the broader scale on disease and where we're at on that scale. Um, what is the state of disease? What's your sort of general take on that? And then where are we at from a policy or legislative perspective? And is there anything on the federal level that's happening, or provincially or state-wise? Just a little bit of an overview on that.
Yeah, so as I quickly kind of alluded to earlier without really touching on it much, some of our time in Washington, D.C. was focused on that, the ability to manage federal lands and the associated grazing allotments with that. So the ability to put domestic livestock on the landscape, and done so for very good reasons, right? For fuel abatement, to recover some fees, and just general livestock grazing, which is a very healthy management practice. But yet, when it occurs, when wild sheep interact with domestic sheep, it's not good for either the domestic or the wild sheep, and certainly very peril for the wild sheep. And so there are practices in place, and some of those take a lot of time for BLM and Forest Service to be able to implement, and the staffing and just the procedure, the onerous federal procedures. And so we had conversations again with the federal agencies about ensuring that this risk of contact is part of that decision-making process. And if those grazing allotments are retired, let's not re-up them with domestic sheep back in them, and let's not sort of recreate an old problem again. And can we look for cattle in some of those places? Because in a number of states, the domestic sheep and the wild sheep industry work very, very closely. And in fact, they're very solution-based. And so Montana's one of those. They work really, Wyoming as well. They work really closely together. And so, and neither one of them are pointing fingers at each other, which is fantastic. Rather, they're trying to find solutions. And many of the chapters are leading that at those levels in Montana and Wyoming. So fantastic partnership and collaboration occurring there. So there's challenges, and there's multi-state projects as you move sort of further south and west that are taking place. But there's also sort of the broader discussion there from a disease standpoint about understanding the health of the animals. It's, that disease thing is like a vicious cycle, right? So when the animal gets diseased, if the animal isn't healthy, it doesn't have the ability for the natural ability to overcome disease. And so understanding the condition of the existing habitats, and that, again, sort of the ecology, the animal habitat relationship, and in a sort of a changing habitat. I know when you look sort of just to the west of you a little bit and you see brush encroachment going up the mountain, what's that coming from? Is it's a little bit warmer, it's a little bit drier. So are range conditions as good as they were? What's forage conditions like? So there's a lot of things to determine that as well.
Hmm. So we've been living with disease now for a long time, and we've seen some pretty significant die-offs. What more can we do? Is it just keep on keeping on, do the best we can, or is there a light at the end of the tunnel on this disease issue, or is it just something that we're just going to have to fight every day for the rest of our lives on?
Yeah, so there's lots of course, provincial governments and state governments that are working on that at that level as well, and some multi-jurisdictional work that's taking place to the collaborative projects, again, that's some really large scale. And then there's also some academic works that's taking place there, trying to look at do vaccinations, is there ability to administer that from the domestic side as well? And so it's far from sort of give up. We'll never cry defeat, that's for sure, because there's opportunities to work smartly on the landscape. And there's also opportunities to ensure that we have as resilient of species of wild sheep, meaning that we are trying to build the best habitat conditions possible. So then that gives them the ability to be resilient and overcome a number of these kind of issues potentially. So through a lot of different work, a lot of collaboration, a lot of state and provincial agencies working together, there is a good path forward. But each one is working through that now. Fortunately, Wild Sheep Foundation is I wouldn't say in the middle, but working collaboratively with lots of them. So fortunately, there's a lot of great minds working on this right now.
Yeah, a lot of novel techniques too, right? Working dogs for conservation and a whole bunch of
Yep.
other projects like that. But the one thing we're just not seeing is a vaccine or anything on that front. That's been a lot of work been done on that over the years, and just a really, really challenging file.
It is. Yeah, it's not a simple answer because when you look from north to south, I mean, the landscapes, the ability to impact those species, change dramatically. So that alone is a challenge. But again, the great thing is that the very passionate, dedicated people that are working on this. So a lot of great minds putting time into it, and there's a path forward here.
That's awesome. So, Corey, we brought you into the foundation, and you brought a very significant skill set that's to me really exciting, and quite a bit different than a lot of our current staff. And so when you're the 8 months you've been on the ground now, and you've been able to see the operation, what kind of opportunities do you see out there? What are some of the things that you're thinking, hey, I can really affect some real cool change here, and something that maybe we haven't tapped on, or something that you can expand on that will really help wild sheep in the future?
Yeah, it's been fantastic to get to meet and work with the staff really closely in a lot of different programs, and from Sheep Show, of course, which is sort of right in the middle of that, to looking at each one of them's different departments as they work. And so I have known Kurt Alt for many, many years and worked with him closely. So working now shoulder to shoulder with Kevin as well, and I think there's some great opportunities with our grant and aid program to be really effective and continue to strategize again based on those sort of ecology relationships of the landscape and that habitat first kind of a mentality. Again, not putting disease on the shelf because it's really important, but understanding the focus on habitat on the ground projects, and the ability to continue to for us to be thought leaders in the spaces. Again, if it's public lands, to calm the waters and provide clarity to those discussions so that the discussions are transformative and they're productive. And I think Wild Sheep Foundation is an industry leader in that, without a doubt. And also the ability, I've enjoyed working really closely with the staff. It's a fantastic team. As you know, they're really talented folks. And I've enjoyed being able to serve in a small capacity as a resource to them as well, and provide whatever assistance I can to that team as well. So there's a lot of opportunities, and I will continue to work really closely to build a relationship with the state agencies. In fact, I sort of look at the schedules just a few months out. Again, I'll be at the Sheep Symposium later this week, and then we have WAFR right around the corner, the summer meeting. So Kevin Gray and I will be there meeting with all the Western state agency directors, the program leads, providing our resources and really bringing a couple of things. The first will be the spirit of collaborative conservation. How can we support your efforts? And then secondarily, really encouraging that transparency and where those dollars go, because I think if the understanding of where those conservation permit dollars go is better understood, people will appreciate we're literally putting more sheep on the mountain for everyone to appreciate, from the hiker to the photographer to the hunter that draws that really coveted tag. So yeah, there's a lot of great opportunities ahead of us.
Awesome. Well, it's interesting. This permit thing, it just rears its ugly head every step of the way. And it's interesting. So do you think if we better educate people, the foundation does such a phenomenal job on where their grant and aid dollars go. It's so transparent. If anyone ever and there's I guess the guys that are always throwing the negative comments out there, that they'll always that they have an agenda, right? So, but the foundation is very clear on where their dollars go. But when it goes to the state, like you said, it's not quite as transparent. So do you think if we're able to do a better job, or they're able to do a better job in communicating that, is it really going to change things? I feel like a lot of the stuff we get is internally. I feel like it's not even so much the anti-hunting community. I know there's a little bit of that, but certainly the general public just doesn't seem to care. But I feel like it's internally within the hunting community that people are having the issue.
It is. It's pretty disgraceful because it's a bit of cannibalism within the hunting community, that someone wants to throw a rock, if you will. And unfortunately, they're willing to throw it maybe at Wild Sheep Foundation because we were the organization that stood up and said, "Hey, we'll auction this permit for you. We'll encounter all the expenses to do that and the exposure, and then we'll send the dollars back to the state agency to do that work, or provincial government or tribe First Nation." But yet at the same time, there are organizations that they're willing to put sort of their own interest first. But I do think, to answer your question, that if we have, more clarity provided, a number of the states specifically that show, hey, here's the 6 projects we funded, here's where the dollars went. Just sort of public shaming really is what it would be, because it's like, how can you criticize that? These are the biologists on the ground with their management plans at the state level, guided by their biologists, their commissions, and they're determining at their management level authority that these are the greatest conservation needs for that species in that state. And to criticize that is honestly just ignorant. And so, when there's more clarity provided with that out, it certainly makes it more difficult to criticize it, at least in any way that's not just someone that just wants to, just to be a pain in the rear.
Well said. Okay, so on a personal level, what's your plans for the fall? Do you have any fall hunts planned, or do you have anything? Obviously, I'm looking at your game room there, and it's filled with amazing international animals. I'm not sure what else is there, but what's your plans for the fall of 2025?
Yeah, that's fun to talk about. So my wife and daughter and I, we always enjoy deer hunting. We have a lease that we have about 4 hours from the house, and so my daughter runs in the fall, so it makes it a little bit challenging. She's in high school, so weekends are often taken up when she's out of school. But when it's not, we chase deer a lot because that fills the freezer, and we enjoy those times. And my father and I chase mule deer every year, so really enjoy that. That's a fun pastime of mine. I don't have any great tags or anything this year. I was fortunate to take an elk in Colorado a year ago, so that was a good tag burner, if you will, in a good way. So that's what I have on the slate right now, and we'll try to maybe sneak in a bird hunt or two, and maybe a fishing trip. So that's kind of where we are this season.
Awesome. Do you play the tag game? Do you put in for all the big draws, like particularly the sheep stuff, or you just kind of not so much?
Haven't in the last few years. My travel has been when I was with DSC, my travel was pretty extreme, and it was weeks at a time internationally. And so the unpredictability of my schedule made that really challenging. And so now that it's certainly something that I plan to get into now, but just the last 6, 7 years, it was just impractical for me. So.
Now, do you find your travel schedule a little bit more manageable with the foundation? I know you're still really busy. Obviously, probably most of your travel is going to be domestic as opposed to international, but how do you find it?
Yeah, the domestic travel, and it's not honestly 3 weeks at a time in a foreign land, and which was very rewarding, but it's different. And now it's like, just if I just look at the schedule, like I said, I'll be traveling out west a few days here, which is no big deal. But then Grant, I'll be traveling to WAFA, then down to, of course, the chapter and affiliate summit, and then some trips over the summer here and there, some projects and things like that. And I'll be headed to the Wildlife Society annual conference in Canada in October, which is the same time in which the IUCN World Congress is occurring internationally as well. And so we're kind of dividing and conquering there. So it's great as well to have a team that can split these things up and make these travel and represent the foundation well. So I think that really helps a lot too.
Right on. Where's the TWS conference at?
It's in Alberta.
Is it Calgary or?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Yeah. I believe it was in Kamloops last year in BC here, but I could be wrong on that. So.
Yeah. So I'm excited about that. We're going to be there, and I'll be speaking on a panel there. So excited about that. Speaking specifically about, no surprise to you, the conservation impact and delivery from an NGO organization. So.
Awesome. Well, that's great. Well, fantastic. Well, Corey, thank you so much for your time today. And anything else you want to share? Anything that we didn't cover? Anything that the foundation membership needs to know, or something to keep on the horizon, or anything the foundation could do, the membership can do to support the foundation, other than the obvious of just doing what they're doing?
No, I appreciate that, and I really appreciate the opportunity to join you, Kyle. Thank you very much for that. And I guess the only thing I would offer in sort of entailing here is just the encouragement to engage with Wild Sheep Society of BC, engage with Wild Sheep Foundation, engage with the chapter affiliate wherever you are, because of the state level needs and opportunities and the federal level and international level needs for wild sheep and habitat conservation, because there are plenty, but the dollars are focused and they're really impactful. So, yeah, it's great to be with you today.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Corey. Appreciate your time and look forward to seeing you down at Chapter Affiliates next month, I guess.
That sounds great. Looking forward to it.